It is well known that the UK has some of the highest electricity prices in the world. Now, critics of net zero argue that relying on renewable energy is a big factor behind these record-breaking price increases. Renewable energy has risen to 50%, but this has coincided with a period of rising electricity prices. Yet, at the same time, the marginal cost of solar and wind energy keeps getting lower. It's one of the great technological success stories of recent years. So how come adding more renewable energy to the grid is coinciding with higher prices? The answer is a little bit complex. But importantly, in the UK, electric is set by the marginal cost of the last electric added. And this means in practice that 98% of electricity generated is determined by the price of natural gas. And since 2021, of course, there's been a big rise in gas prices, big rise in cost of importing it. And this is the biggest single factor in higher energy bills of recent years. And by the way, if you want some good news, gas prices have fallen 15% since March, though it will of course take time to actually feed through into lower household bills. But if a rise in electric prices is due to the rise in the price of gas, it does beg the question, why is gas determining 98% of electricity prices? Because it's certainly not in other European countries. The UK is an outlier in how much gas determines electric prices. In fact, gas is only 14% of total electricity generation. This graph shows how the UK energy mix has changed since the 1970s. It was dominated by coal and oil. Nuclear power increased in the 1990s, but has importantly tailed off in the past 5 years. Renewables are now the biggest source of energy, but there is unfortunately a limitation to wind and solar electric generation, and that they depend on the weather. If it's cloudy and not windy, then renewables produce very little electricity, and so the UK needs to fire up its natural gas stations to keep the grid going. So renewables do have this limitation. They're harder to store, they have higher transmission costs, and in fact the cost of balancing the UK grid has increased a lot in recent years. And importantly, from April 2023, this cost of rebalancing was put on consumers rather than both producers and consumers like it was before. Therefore, even though the marginal cost of producing wind energy is very low, it doesn't help actually reduce your electricity prices. Also, this dependence on gas to fill shortages can give the gas producers a lot of monopoly power in charging very high prices during this peak demand. It's kind of a shame that this critical energy infrastructure wasn't kept in public ownership. Another big problem was that we decommissioned many offshore gas storage facilities and not replaced, because it's much easier to store gas rather than store electricity. Also, just worth mentioning that privatisation may well have had some problems, but if we look at UK electric prices since 1970, it was privatisation, and in particular deregulation of electricity industry in the early 1990s, which saw that really sharp fall in electricity prices. Now, are renewables really to blame for UK's higher prices? If we look at an international comparison, many countries, Denmark, Brazil, Norway, have a much higher share of renewables, but also much cheaper electricity. Now, part of the reason is that these European countries have a few advantages. Firstly, Norway can make a lot from hydroelectric power. It's a renewable source of electricity, but it's much more stable than wind or solar. You could say it's almost the ideal electric source. Now, one reason for high electricity prices in the UK is it comes back to the UK's difficulty in recent years of building things. Whether it is HS2, new power lines, or new nuclear power stations, it just tends to be much more expensive and more time consuming than anywhere else. Take the most expensive nuclear power station in the world. It's estimated to cost 41 to 48 billion pounds by the time it's finished in 2029. There's an argument the UK has higher costs of building because of planning regulations, the need to have so many consultations, over-regulation compared to other countries, and a lack of economies of scale in building. Though it is worth bearing in mind that when this new power station is built, it will produce 7% of the UK's total electricity enough to power 6 million homes for 60 years, and nuclear power is of course much more stable, but not without its difficulties. Now, after 2004, the UK was no longer able to be self-sufficient in gas. Currently, we import more than 50%. Now, one argument against net zero is that the UK should be drilling for more oil and gas in the North Sea, perhaps even fracking in the Lancashire countryside. Now, banning licences for investment in the North Sea doesn't alter the total amount of fossil fuels used in the world. It really just changes whether we produce them ourselves or import them. But the big problem really with this argument is that the UK just doesn't have many North Sea reserves left at all. By 2050, production is expected to fall 97%. And even if we issue new licences, it would still fall by 95%. Even if the UK did issue new licences and increase the supply of gas or oil, it would do very little to alter the international price of gas, which is determined by global demand and global supply. Now, another criticism of net zero policies with regard to environmental taxes. VAT is 5% on domestic bills and 20% for most business. Industry is also charged a climate change levy. For the average household, 16% of a final bill is taxes. For gas, it is just 6%. Bills could be modestly reduced by removing levies on energy use, especially for electricity, which is by far the most expensive. But if we reduce taxes here, it would require higher taxes elsewhere, so giving with one hand, taking away with another. Now, VAT on fuel is not entirely regressive, because higher income households do tend to use just a lot more electricity. They have bigger houses, more heating, more appliances, maybe electric cars. But at the same time, energy does tend to be a higher share of income for the very poor. So there is an argument there to maybe shift VAT to something that is more progressive. Now, another way to answer this question is, would the UK been better off if we had not built any renewables, but just kept coal power burning stations going? Well, coal burning does have many negative externalities. Pollution leads to acid rain, climate change, mercury poisoning, high rates of cancer and respiratory diseases. In the US, it was estimated there was around 13,000 to 20,000 premature deaths related to the coal burning industry. So renewables do give us cleaner air, less pollution, less health problems, and it also helps to reduce the amount of import of energy that we need. Now, if we had coal-powered stations in 2022, it definitely would have been able to prevent some of the surge in prices because gas was so limited. But it is worth bearing in mind that, as well as all the externalities of coal, its cost is relatively high, around 100 to 160 megawatt hours compared to, say, 70 to 120 for gas. Now, putting net zero to one side for a moment, there are also many other factors causing high prices in the UK electricity market. Due to contracts given out in the past decade, we're in a position where the government pay firms to turn off wind power when there's surplus energy. The zonal pricing would help encourage energy-intensive industries to move to those regions where there's this surplus of electricity. It prevents us paying to turn it off and then paying to create new electricity elsewhere. And it is a real scandal we're paying so much subsidies to wind farms to turn off energy when we produce too much. But it is worth bearing in mind the UK isn't just subsidising renewables, but fossil fuels, consumers and biomass as well. It's a real mess, so expensive, and still we get high prices despite all these massive subsidies. Now, interesting question since the experience of Spain is, does relying on renewables make the grid less stable? Well, it does depend on how it is managed. Certainly, even in the 1970s when coal was 90%, the UK did have blackouts. Well done if you were old enough to remember the 3-day week before my time. 2021, Texas had a massive energy blackout in the middle of winter. But one of the reasons was it ran an independent grid. Power was cut off from other US regions, limiting its ability to import energy. And also it gave very much market incentives to only reward producing electricity just in time. There was no rewards for capacity or backup readiness. And that's an interesting dilemma in the energy market. On the one hand, the market incentives can help reduce prices, but the market tends to avoid these less profitable backup capacity and dealing with emergency which can occur, like just happened in Spain just last week. They had a major blackout And at the time, 59% of the energy was coming from solar power, 12% wind, and gas plants just 5%. Now, one theory is that solar energy has a lower inertia, which can make the grid more vulnerable to this kind of switch off. Now, I'm no physicist, just an economist, so I don't really understand this inertia argument, though it is worth pointing out that it was a warm, sunny day, and it's not clear why power would drop so drastically. So it's tempting to jump to conclusions, but it would be interesting to learn the full story. And of course, the great irony is that if you're worried about power blackouts because of the renewable energy, the best thing to do is get solar panels for your roof, battery backup, and you could find yourself suddenly very popular with neighbours and friends who are desperate to recharge their electronic device. So renewable energy does have many potential advantages: lower pollution, lower prices, reduced amount of imports, and reduced dependence on fossil fuels. But it's not an easy switch. But you can't just build more wind power stations and solar panels and expect everything to work perfectly. The energy mix has to be right. And the good news is that we'll have continued technological improvements in the coming years. And what we really need is much better battery technology, better battery storage, which at the moment really is in its infancy. But there's a lot of potential things 5, 10, 20 years down the line. Now, the UK did make many mistakes in the past decade, notably a lack of investment in the national grid and a decline in the power output from nuclear power stations. The UK is also hampered by a lack of hydropower. We have looked at something in the Severn Estuary but never got made into reality. Other European countries have this bigger advantage, and they have a greater diversity of renewables. But despite these past mistakes, there are solutions: reducing end-use demand through greater efficiency, zonal pricing to help market rebalance, continued investment in nuclear, perhaps taking help from countries who know how to do it better. So it's not all doom and gloom. There is an outlook for cheaper electricity prices and less pollution in the future. Let's hope we get there. Now, high electric prices are not the only things causing a squeeze of middle income workers. This video looks at all the factors that have caused the average worker to see a stagnation in incomes. Well, thanks for watching, and do subscribe if you think it's worthwhile. And let me know what you think in the comments, and maybe see you soon.